So the first thing that you need to do to start making your bezel is wrap your bezel wire around your cabochon stone to get the measurement. So one thing that you want to make sure that you're doing is keeping your bezel wire straight up and down and not smashing it around the stone so you can get the accurate measurement to cut your wire. I cut my wire slightly larger than what I think I need, just like a millimeter or two, but that will give you space so you can adjust that bezel and make sure it's perfectly the right size. From here, now you just want to take your flat nose pliers and work your bezel wire until the two ends are meeting up perfectly. I usually bend the wire past each other in both directions, and then that will give it enough tension so it sets up against itself without having anything to hold it together. You should be able to hold your bezel wire up against the light and not be able to see any light shining through the top or the bottom of your bezel seam. It should be a perfect connection. Once you have that seam perfectly closed, you can put it in your third arm at the soldering station and solder it just the same as we did with the band rings. So I'm clipping just a tiny little millimeter square of sheet solder, and then I'm picking that up with my flux on a paintbrush and putting it perfectly on the middle of the seam. I'm using my torch to slowly is the key word, heat around my bezel. You want to heat your bezel slowly until all of your flux has bubbled up, or your little piece of solder will jump on you. So you just saw mine jump a little bit, so you might have to come back in and then make some adjustments with your soldering pick if it does move around on you. Once your flux has bubbled up and turned white, then you can apply some more direct heat. I'm also taking the heat away though, so it's kind of a back and forth between getting it red hot and then taking the heat away quickly. If you get it too hot too fast, your bezel wire will just melt because it's so fragile. After it's done being soldered, you can take your bezel and your cabochon stone and form your bezel into the correct shape for your stone by forcing your stone back and forth through it in both directions, from the back and from the front. And then I roll it on the table until the edges are completely flat and it's perfectly the right shape. This is one of the most important steps because if you don't get your bezel into the correct shape and you solder it down to your base plate, your stone won't fit into it later. So there's mine perfectly shaped. Then the next step is to get your bezel perfectly flat so it will sit flat on your base plate. So I'm just tapping almost like I'm tapping on a mouse's door. That's how light I'm tapping with the rawhide mallet, and then making figure-8 motions on the sanding board to get that bottom of the bezel perfectly flat. Then I can use my bezel to mark and get the perfect size base plate for my flush cut bezel. I'm just using the metal shears to cut this out. You can also use a saw if you want and you have some thicker metal. A saw might be the right way to go. Then you need to make sure your base plate is perfectly flat, so I'm using my rawhide mallet and bench block, and then you can also use your sanding board to make it as flat as possible. This is really nice because you can pick it up and actually see if you've sanded it all the way and if it is perfectly flat, and if there's still spots that you need to work on, you can keep sanding. So you should be able to hold your bezel and your base plate up stacked on top of each other to the light, and you shouldn't be able to see any light shining through. If you can still see light shining through, you know that you need to work more on your bezel or your base plate until they sit perfectly flat together. So here's mine all finished and I can't see any light, and I know that when I go to solder it's going to be a perfect connection. So now it's time to solder your bezel to your base plate. So I'm using medium sheet solder this time, and I'm just going to cut 5 or 6 1mm squares of this, and then I use my little flux paintbrush to pick them up, and I kind of drag it across the top of the bezel, and the little piece of solder should drop down and sit right on that seam between where your bezel meets up with your base plate. And they should be evenly spaced around your bezel. So it's kind of hard to see, but you can see that they're pretty evenly spaced, and there's 5 or 6 of them all along the edge where that bezel meets up with the base plate. It is really important to heat your bezel and base plate slowly at first. Otherwise, your little pieces of solder that you spent all that time arranging will jump like a little jumping bean, and then you'll lose them. So please just save yourself the trouble and heat this as slow as you can go. Make those tiny adjustments with your soldering pick if any solder moves. And really you'll end up with a better product because everything will be in place right where you intended it to be, instead of having to make some adjustments after that solder melts. So really just take your time, heat it slow until everything bubbles up uniformly, and then you can apply heat a little bit more liberally. So I'm just moving my flame around the outside of the bezel, and I'm focusing the heat on the base plate actually. The reason that I heat mostly from the outside edge is because we want that solder to flow underneath the seam. So if I'm heating from the outside and the solder chips are on the inside, the solder will flow where the heat is and be sucked underneath that seam between the bezel and the base plate. And I'm heating everything to a uniform red heat. And I'm just being really careful not to get things too hot because you are still in danger of melting your whole bezel at this point. So that looks good. Quench your bezel in water, and you should be able to check and make sure that your bezel seam has been soldered shut completely. Then stick it in the pickle pot for 10-15 minutes. And then it's time to trim your base plate away. So I just do this with a saw. And I just take some time to saw as close up to the edge of the bezel as I can get without cutting into the bezel itself. So here's what my bezel looks like after trimming, and then you just have to file away all of the extra metal that's sticking out beyond it. It's really important to be careful with your bezel at this point because the metal is so thin. You don't want to apply too much pressure and bend it. But what you're going for is the edges to be perfectly smooth, and you should only be able to see file marks. If you can see little hazy marks, you know that you still have some filing to do. So that's part 1 of how to make a basic bezel. The next video will be about how to use those basic bezels to make other things like rings, earrings, or bezels that have extending base plates.